Let me start by saying how glad I am to once again stand before you in this famous hall named after Ghana's Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. I'm also glad that I'm here on an occasion to once again remember one of the greatest sons of Africa, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And I'm happy that I'm doing this in the presence of distinguished Africans and a sprinkling of individuals from other civilizations. It gladdens my heart that every year this university takes time to bring together men and women to think about the evergreen subject of African unity. Exactly 56 years ago, on the 24th day of May 1963, there was a meeting such as this in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And many of you who were alive then, and those who are not alive, courtesy of history, will remember that one of the great themes of that meeting was African unity. Present at that meeting were 32 heads of states and governments of the then independent African countries. And if one were to read or to listen to the speeches that were delivered on that day, one could discern a common thread. Tanzania's Kambarage Nyerere said on that day, among others, that we have not come here to remind ourselves how important unity is. We know that unity is at the very heart of the future of the continent of Africa. Even some of the leaders who subsequently did not serve Africa well thought well on that day, so that even individuals such as David Dacko of Central African Republic thought that unity was a good thing, and many of them were as eloquent as they were unanimous in recognizing that unity was critical to the survival of the continent. But the most eloquent and indeed the most celebrated speech of the day was one that was delivered not only with passion, but with a sense of urgency. It was the speech of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. He reminded his audience on that day that it was right to celebrate the independence that had been regained. But he did not stop there. He reminded them that having regained independence, they should not rest on their laurels, because Africa and African countries had regained independence at a time when imperialism was in the ascendancy. And he reminded them that the imperialism that they were confronting was mature imperialism that was subtle and subterranean in our ways. He reminded his audience that if Africa was to retain her independence in a meaningful way, there was need for Africans to unite there and then. There was need for Africans to create one government, Kwame Nkrumah said. There was need to ensure that all the artificial boundaries that had been carved out in Berlin in 1884 were dissolved. There was need to ensure that intra-African trade was enhanced. And there was need for African leaders on that day to remind themselves that however bitter and painful it would be to lose what they described as sovereignty, they had to dissolve sovereignty for the sake of a united Africa. But that was a lonely voice on that day. It was a lonely voice because nobody agreed with Kwame. Even the great Mwalimu Nyerere at that time did not agree with Kwame Nkrumah. He was to say 40 years later that Nkrumah was right and we were wrong. And indeed, when we are gathered here today, we are asking ourselves what it is that we can do to bring to fruition what Nkrumah thought was urgent on that day. Because Nkrumah lost on that day, and we came up with an organization known as the Organization of African Unity, whose history you know. It used to be said by some who are not very charitable to the Organization of African Unity that it was a dog that could not bite. But the question is, did it even have teeth? So that when in a few years we as Africans through our leaders recognized that we had to change the name of the Organization of African Unity, we were reminding ourselves that indeed Nkrumah was right, and that those who had recognized the mistakes that had been made before, like Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, were equally right. That the younger leaders who came a little later, such as Samora Moises Machel and Agostino Neto, were right. That even younger ones like Thomas Sankara were right. So that there is a sense in which today when we talk about African unity and Pan-Africanism, there are those who say that the African problem has been overanalyzed and that therefore we should not analyze it anymore. There are those who say that we know what the problem is and that we should not talk about it anymore. There are those who say that words add to nothing and that we should do nothing anymore. But the truth is that because we did not unite 56 years ago, Africa is in a state which sometimes is saddening. Sometimes we delude ourselves into thinking that everything is right. But I want you just this morning for a few moments to do a geographical tour of Africa with me, if only to appreciate that what we think is peace and quiet is calm that is dangerous. Look at West Africa today. Which of the countries that I'm about to name has not known any pain after our failure to unite? If you look at Sierra Leone, all of us will remember the civil war whose effects are still well today. If you look at Liberia, she may have emerged out of the civil war, but you know that the pain is still there. If you look at Cote d'Ivoire, you can say the same. If you look at the Gambia, even Benin, as I talk now, whether it is Togo or Gabon, and when you come to the Sahelian region, if you talk to the Mauritanians or the Malians or the Central African Republicans or the Chadians or the Burkinabe, we know that there are problems in those countries. If you go up north, those who think that you could solve Libya's problem by killing Muammar al-Gaddafi, now let them go and see what is happening in Libya. If you go to Algeria, if you go to Sudan, you go to South Sudan, you go to Somalia, you go to the Eastern Congo, Africa is not at ease. Perhaps, with the help of hindsight, we can now say, without fear of contradiction, that if we had only listened to Kwame Nkrumah, that if we had only listened to the founding fathers, Africa would be different. But as we sit here today, we know that Africa can be great. We know that Africa should be great. We know that there are many Africans across the world who now recognize that the long-term health of the continent not only demands but requires that we are united. But we also know that Kwame Nkrumah was right. The imperialist is alive and well. The colonialist may have gone, but he is alive and well despite protestation to the contrary. If you doubt it, only ask the Cameroonians how they have continued to manipulate that country even as Africans die. If you doubt it, ask the people of Central African Republic how they have continued to manipulate, so much so that we remain the only continent in the world that is still described in linguistic terms. So you will hear the imperialists in the unguarded moment saying, Anglophone Africa. But when you go to the so-called Anglophone Africa, not even more than 25% speak French. We are only Anglophone because we were colonized by France, which never left. They never left because even the currency that some countries continue to use is still printed in Paris. They never left, and they don't intend to leave. If you go to the former British colonies, the experience is the same despite protestation to the contrary. I know that the Commonwealth has done many good things, but it was a clever way of ensuring that the countries that had regained their independence were still kept on a short leash, so that we were British. We are of the same family. When we are crediting our ambassadors, we don't even call them ambassadors. We call them high commissioners. And then we are told when we meet as the Commonwealth that this is a family of equal nations, but that family must at all times be headed by the Queen of England. And when the Queen of England is tired, the son of the Queen of England heads it. That is the reality. How you define equality of nations. 56 years after our leaders met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. When you go to the Portuguese, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Mozambique, even the weak Portugal still thinks that they must dictate to the Africans. And we also are to blame. Sometimes we behave as if our former colonizers have a divine duty to tell us what to do, and as if we too have a divine duty to accept what they tell us. So we are co-authors of our own misfortune. Samora Moises Machel, speaking in 1982, said, and I repeat not verbatim, but in effect, he said, that one of the tragedies of Africa is that sometimes Africans in the unguarded moments even are proud. Those who were colonized by the French say, we were colonized by a better colonizer who has better food and better cuisine. And those who were colonized by the British say, we were colonized by a better colonizer. And you who are colonized by Portugal, one of the weakest and one of the most backward nations in Europe, you are no better than us. And Samora said, how can slaves be saying how good one slave master is better than the other? And I'm submitting to us that that still remains our problem in Africa. When we talk about Pan-Africanism, we ourselves stand in the way. Particularly those of us who have gone to school. Those of us who have gone to school who still think that in order to be intelligent, you must speak English or French or Portugal. Those of us who have gone to school who tell our children that we must not speak our mother tongue in this house. Those of us who now think that Mandarin is the next thing that we must begin to speak because China is on the ascendancy. Africa must unite. But Africa is not going to unite because of the number of seminars and symposia that we hold. No, not at all. We have held enough symposia, we have had enough workshops about uniting Africa. But what I begin to see is that the masses of Africa are beginning to rise and making demands of their leaders. Several years ago, I remember one of the greatest speeches ever delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. when he was talking about the civil rights movement, and the African Americans were beginning to get tired in the same way that we too sometimes we are beginning to get tired. And that famous speech in which Martin Luther Jr. asked, how long? I'm sure many Africans are asking, for how long shall we wait for this African unity? And his response, not long. And I too believe that we are going to unite as a continent, but we must be able to identify the reasons why we want our unity. Have you ever asked why this continent has always been attractive to other civilizations? What is it that so many years ago, before the white man came into this continent, what is it that the Arabs saw? Because the Arab was here. We never talk about it. The very first people to go into the eastern coast of Africa were Arabs. And they enslaved Africans. We never talk about it loudly for purposes of political correctness. What is it that they saw? What is it that the Europeans saw in 1884 that Africa was carved out? What did the Germans want in Namibia? What did they want in Dahomey? What did they want in Rwanda, Urundi? The Germans who are in Germany, why did they want to come here? Have you ever asked that question? Have you ever asked yourself why little Portugal wanted Angola, why they wanted Guinea-Bissau, why they wanted Mozambique? What did they want here? Have you ever asked why the British had to move several thousand miles, that little island, to come and take Nigeria and take Sudan and take East Africa and go down south? Have you ever asked what little Belgium wanted in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or what the Italians wanted in Ethiopia, although they were stopped, or what they wanted in Eritrea, or what they wanted in Libya? Have you ever asked? Africa has resources. But African resources have always taken different forms. There was a time when the African himself was a resource. There was such a time. And it's not even that can be talked about in historical terms. As I talk to you now, slavery is back alive and well in Libya. Africans are being enslaved as I talk now, and being sold in Libya to Europe as I talk now. As I talk now, slavery has taken a different form. As I talk now, our minds are not decolonized. That is why 10,000 young men and women die in the Mediterranean Sea every year. We are not counting those who die in the desert. We don't, because we don't know. The question is, how will we solve it when our little countries believe that there is something called sovereignty? When a little country whose GDP is no more than $2 billion also has a president, with a cabinet, with a parliament, which is bicameral, with embassies all over the world, and the country, the president of that country with a GDP of $2 billion enters into a bilateral meeting with the president of China. And you say that all nations are equal. If there was ever a joke, that is one. Part of the reason why Africa cannot compete is because Africa is weak. And we are weak because we are divided into 55 odd countries created in Berlin. And we are allowing ourselves to fight amongst ourselves. And as you who are beautiful Kiswahili speakers know and say, vita vya panzi, furaha ya kunguru. And that is exactly what is happening today. The locusts are fighting and the kunguru is ever so happy. They come in and take what they want. And meanwhile, we are left fighting. You tell me, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is easily the wealthiest nation on earth, conservatively it is said that her resources under her belly are in the tune of 34 trillion United States dollars, yet paradoxically and ironically at once, it's one of the poorest nations on earth. We are weak because we are divided. And we are divided by our erstwhile colonizers. I may not have the statistics, but if you go to the former French colonies, you will discover that the French have some detachment of their army inside of those countries. If you go to Burkina Faso, you'll find one. If you go to Niger, you'll find one. If you go to Central African Republic, you'll find one. If you go to Cote d'Ivoire, you'll find one. If you go to Senegal, you'll find one. You go to Benin, you'll find one. You go to Togo, you'll find one. You go to Gabon, you'll find one. When they want to change leaders, they change them like we change underwears. The weaker we are, the stronger they are. And until we recognize that, we are going nowhere. But we have lamented for too long. We have analyzed for too long. We have moralized for too long. We have intellectualized for too long. We have philosophized for too long. We must now ask ourselves, what is the action that must be taken? If Africa is to rise and rise in a meaningful way, our young men and women must now begin to rise. And to rise in a creative way, because we are able to see when our affairs are being run in an improper way. We have seen in northern part of Africa a few years ago, when the people recognized that the leaders were not governing well in Tunisia, they rose up. When they recognized that the people are not governing well in Egypt, they rose. Right now, they have recognized that the people are not governing well in Algeria, they have risen. In Sudan, they have recognized that the leaders are not governing well, they are rising. Perhaps one of the things that we must do is to awaken our young men and women and to tell them what Pan-Africanism means. What is Pan-Africanism? What is it? The thing that we keep on talking about, what is it? And my submission is that Pan-Africanism will only make sense when the Baba in Kariakor market here in Dar es Salaam and the market woman in Bangui in the Central African Republic have a common understanding of what Pan-Africanism is. In other words, time has come that we must remove our definitions of Pan-Africanism out of the university lecture theaters and symposia such as this and break it down so that it can be consumed by real people in Africa. It is only then that we are going to make Africa great. It is only then that we are going to make the dream of Kwame Nkrumah come to fruition. But I've been asked to pose and at once answer the question, what are the things that stand in our way toward the realization of Pan-Africanism? And there are many of them. One of them is the state of our mind. It is that great African-American Martin Luther King Jr. who used to say, the mind is the standard of the man. And I can't agree more with him. The mind is the standard of the man. And the Caucasians and progressively the Asians are always ahead of us because they choose to think long term. You know, last year I was watching the Chinese at their meeting of their Politburo, 3,000 or is it 6,000 men in dark suits, talking in eloquent Mandarin. And what they were thinking and talking about is how to deal with the world, including Africa. And they were thinking how China will relate to the world 100 years from that date, acutely aware that none of them in that room would be alive in 100 years' time. In many African capitals, if you ask people to think about 5 years, they think it is too far. They ask you, will I be alive in 5 years? We Africans sometimes believe that we must plant the tree and enjoy her fruits. No, we cannot. Wisdom has demonstrated not once, not twice, that those who plant the tree must and indeed never eat the fruit. Their joy is in planting the tree, that history may remember them. And I'm submitting to us that we must decolonize our mind. Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o was right, that it is the decolonization of our minds that will be the beginning of our proper appreciation of where we want to go. What do I mean, decolonizing the mind? We must recognize that we live in a global world, that we cannot escape. We must recognize that we are going to relate with other civilizations, that we cannot escape. We must recognize that we are going to work with the Chinese, with the English, with the French, with the Americans, with the Indians, and with the Arabs, and that if we do not work smart, they will outsmart us. Because everybody does what is in their best interest. Has Africa defined what is in her best interest? I'm submitting that we have not. If we have defined it very narrowly as Tanzanians. But what is Tanzania in the scheme of things? What is the economic power of Tanzania in the scheme of things? At the very best, the GDP of Tanzania last year must be below 50 billion United States dollars. I am quite certain that one of the big boxers in the United States of America can earn that in a year. What is the economy of Kenya in the scheme of things at $60 billion, or Burundi or Togo? Perhaps the advertisement budget of Coca-Cola is bigger than the budget of all East African countries combined. That is the truth. Because I'm submitting to you that the Indian economy alone is bigger than all the economies of African countries combined. India alone. Brazil's economy alone is bigger than all our countries combined. That is why you see when the Chinese president invites African president, all of them, without exception, run to Beijing very quickly. And when they get to Beijing, they are given $60 billion, all of them, the 55 of them, to share. And I ask myself, why don't you ask Nigeria's Aliko Dangote? You don't have to move. Aliko will give you $60 billion. He has it. And if he doesn't have it, you ask Patrick Motsepe from South Africa to add a little more. And if you didn't ask him, and may his soul rest in peace before he passed on, you asked Reginald Mengi here to add a little more. He could. And if it is not much, there is no shortage of Africans who can give you that much. Because there is no free lunch. Because nobody does anything in this cutthroat world where throats are actually cut without having an interest. I'm submitting that in order for Africa to grow, it is we who have gone to school who must ask ourselves, what kind of schools did we go to? Is that great Nigerian singer, Fela Kuti, who used to sing in a song that I remind us about, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense." Perhaps we were taught nonsense. And there is a need to unlearn some of the things that we learned. We have to inspect ourselves, because we who have gone to some kind of formal education in different parts of the world, in our unguarded moments, when you are colonized by the French and you are bragging about your child, you'll hear saying, my child has been admitted at the Sorbonne, if you are from Senegal. But when he's been admitted at the Cheikh Diop University, you don't even say it, because you think instinctively that the Sorbonne is superior. We should hear East Africans and former colonies talking how their children are going to the Ivy League school, not the University of Dar es Salaam. We must decolonize our minds, because the day we decolonize our minds, that is the day we begin to think right. Number two, we must define ourselves. Africa does not define herself. You know, I remember in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it then meant that all the countries that had one-party states had to move into multi-party states. We were told by the conceptual West, and when I talk about the conceptual West, I'm including Australia, those countries that are geographically not in the West. They were telling us through their NGOs, and there is no shortage of them, that democracy means, democracy defined by Europe and America, means that you must have multi-party states, and we formed them in the hundreds. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have 233 political parties. So that if you are looking at the ballot paper in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is as tall as you are, or as long as you are tall, to speak correct English. Then we were told that democracy means that we must have elections every 5 years. And democracy means that the European Union and some other Western agency must come in and observe us and say that you little fellows, you have done a good job. That is effectively what they do. Once they have done that, then they print papers which says, now this is the index of democracy, and we are very happy because Europe and America have told us we are democratic. Not the woman in Butiama. The woman in Butiama has not told us we are democratic. It's Europe and America. It's Paris and Washington. We must define ourselves. But when they are telling Africans that, they don't tell Kuwait that. No, they don't. They don't tell Singapore that. No. They don't tell Saudi Arabia that. That is staple for the African. It is the Africans who must be told what to do, because he is incapable of knowing what he does. We must define ourselves. Who tells us that democracy must be defined by Europe and America? Can't we define our own democracy? Did we not have our forms and systems of governance before we were colonized? Isn't there merit in asking ourselves whether those systems can work better for us? Because experience has now shown that after every other election in Africa, almost the rule is we fight. Perhaps if we redefine ourselves, we'll begin to appreciate what it is that we must do going forward in order to unite. And in the Pan-African spirit, we will be able to recognize that our unity is our salvation. And that is why I'm happy that the African Union has now come up with Africa Agenda 2063. But Africa Agenda 2063 could be one of the pronouncements that we make as a continent. Agenda 2063 says, not in so many words, but in effect, that by the year 2063, Africa will have changed. We'll be economically vibrant. There will possibly be an electric train running from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia to Dakar in Senegal, and one from Luanda in Angola to Swakien in Sudan, and another one from Cape Town in South Africa to Tunis in Tunisia, and that the entire basin of the Rift of the Democratic Republic of Congo will be better than the Silicon Valley, and that we will be trading with each other about 60%. That is Africa Agenda 2063. And one of the things that they promised themselves and ourselves last year is that by the year 2020, all the guns in Africa will be silent. That is next year. Next year, there'll be no more guns. A good thing, but you and me know that the guns are roaring even louder, which means that we must now ask ourselves what it is that we must do. But it's a good beginning, because it is a beginning of defining ourselves and defining who we are. Because let me tell you, and I don't blame the Chinese, but I worry about them and about us. Today, in any African country, notwithstanding that over the years, our universities have produced professionals, the Chinese are the ones building our stadia. I do not know whether the stadium here in Dar es Salaam was built by Tanzanians. You will tell me. I need to be educated. But I suspect that there was a Chinese hand. If you go to Nairobi, Kenya, it's the same. You go to any country, to Uganda, the same. And the Chinese are now, in a very subtle way, in every other African university, they are bringing something called the Confucius Institute. Educate me. At the University of Nairobi, there is one. In Makerere, there is one. In Zambia, there is one. My brethren Tanzanians, tell me, do you have one here? There is no free lunch. The Chinese have recognized that the mind is the standard of the man. And therefore, the way to capture our minds is to have institutes in our highest institutions of learning. Once you capture the minds of their very best, then you've captured them. In 100 years' time, we'll be wondering how they did it. This is how they did it. This is how they did, and I don't blame them one iota. If we were organized as Africans, we would be having the African institutes in each universities, where we would teach comparative culture. Today, a number of countries are adopting Mandarin as the language of choice. We are surrendering to the dominant Chinese culture. And we are wondering how we will be a Pan-African. We are losing the war. We are losing it. The Chinese know what they want, and they must be celebrated and praised for it. Because any civilization that knows what they want will always reach their destination. Do we know what we want? We don't. We must, in the nature of things, restructure our universities. Time has come that we must ask ourselves, what are we teaching at our universities? What are we teaching? If it is in engineering, you go to many engineering schools in Africa and look at the equipment that is being used. Perhaps in some universities, the equipment should be in the museum alongside the spinning wheel. At a time when people are talking about nanotechnology and 5G, you go to typical African university, we're still using blackboard and chalk. and others are teaching differently, yet we think we are going to compete. We are not going to compete. Right now, people are talking about 5G. But what are we Africans doing? We are watching and observing and celebrating as if we are watching a football match between the United States of America and China, asking which one will win? Because the winner is the one that will conquer us again. It's painful but true. We are not there. We are not in the arena. As the saying goes, you can't win the lottery if you don't buy the ticket, and we have not bought the ticket. No amount of prayer and fasting is going to help us. We can pray and fast all we want, but God is not a magician. God tells you, go ye and subdue the world. We are not subduing the world. The world is subduing us. So what are we teaching? We must begin to think differently for the Pan-African project to succeed. We must begin to act as one unit. Recently in Mozambique, Mother Nature devastated the city of Beira. 90% of it was destroyed. The city of Beira, 90% gone. I waited for Africans to say that we are going to donate 1% of our budget. It is only Namibia and South Africa, and to a certain extent Kenya and a few other countries that went there. But the following week, there was a church in Notre Dame in Paris that burned, and within 1 week, they had raised 1 billion. In fact, more, I think, approaching 1 trillion, including a donation from a traditional chief in Côte d'Ivoire, who was very devastated that one of his brothers or somebody related to him had been baptized at the church in Notre Dame. If you now go to Beira, it is not African engineers who are involved in restoring, or African professionals. You will discover that some Portuguese firm, possibly, and some Chinese firm are the ones who are involved. Africa is now in the business of discovering natural gas and oil. Who is exploiting that oil? If it is not tallow, it is ELF. If it is not ELF, it is ExxonMobil. If it is not ExxonMobil, it is Total. Africa, Ali Mazrui was right, produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. We know, but we must remind ourselves, because sometimes we sit pretty and think that everything is fine. Everything is not fine. You are here. Allow me to be morbid. In 100 years' time, all of you will be upstairs. All of you. Without exception. All of you. But I want you to imagine for one moment how Africa will be. You know, some times ago, the Chinese, and I'm on the Chinese because I'm seeing them. I never saw the white man coming. I was too young or unborn. But this one I can see. The Chinese had a policy of only 1 child. Then suddenly they said, we are now allowing couples to have a 2nd child. That 2nd child is going to be here. That 2nd child is the child that is going to conquer us if we are not organized. I do not know, but when I travel across the continent of Africa, I see Chinese very quiet, and African middle class is happiest when they go to a Chinese restaurant on Saturday. We are going for Chinese dinner. It is a statement of how sophisticated we are. I'm submitting to us that we must do something about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, Africa can be great, and Africa must be great, but we must begin to do something about it. The question is, what are we doing? The problem that some of us have is that we feel helpless. We hold the view that we are not in political positions, and therefore we cannot influence processes. My good friend Pole Pole is here, and he is a politician whom I know. The question is, what must you do within your systems in the political arena to begin to energize processes? One must ask, for example, here in the East African region, what are we doing to ensure that in this region we think as one? I fly from Nairobi 1 hour, 5 minutes, and I now have to grapple with Tanzanian shilling. My Kenyan shilling becomes suddenly useless. I leave Tanzania, I go to Burundi, I grapple with the Burundian franc. I leave Burundi, I grapple with the with the Rwandese franc. I go to Uganda, I'm grappling with the Ugandan shilling. I move upstairs, I'm dealing with the pound. I move to Angola, I'm dealing with the kwanza. 55, almost 50 currencies, which are effectively useless. Because even the leaders don't believe in them. When the Sudanese head of state is arrested and they search his house, you don't find the Sudanese pound. You find the American dollar. And you find the euro. We also don't have faith in our own currencies. And our currencies are going to remain weak as long as we are not united. So in the East African region, what can we do? I travel and I get to Julius Kambarage International Airport, and I'm told very politely, as is the culture in Tanzania, jaza fomu ya kuingia. And I obey. But should I, after flying for 1 hour, 5 minutes, an American will fly from Boston in Massachusetts to Oakland in California, 6 hours later, no forms filled, no yellow fever certificate, no passport, no new telephone number. The country works. Here, I'm now in 255, having migrated from 254. I'm dealing with Tigo, and even Tigo is not Tanzania. I'm dealing with Airtel, even Airtel is not Tanzania. I'm dealing with Vodafone. We own nothing. Pole pole. But if we are East Africa, we can begin to own things. When we begin to negotiate as East Africa and we negotiate with the EU, we begin to make sense to them. But if we are alone, somebody was telling me that African economies are growing, and I told them, yes, they are growing. But no matter how fast a goat grows, it can only be a fat goat, it can't be a cow. So what we must do is that we must combine all these little goats into a big elephant, and we'll begin to make sense. Kwame Nkrumah, may he rest in peace. How relevant you are 56 years ago today. When you spoke on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and reminded us that Africa had to unite. If today I were to write, as Nkosana and Lamini Zuma wrote in the year 2013, if today I were to write a letter to our founding fathers who died several years ago, this is how the letter would read. I would not name all of them, but I would name the following. I would say, Dear Kwame Nkrumah, Dear Kambarage Nyerere, Dear Patrice Emery Lumumba, Dear Modibo Keita, Dear Ahmed Sékou Touré, Dear Thomas Sankara, Dear Nelson Holisa Mandela, we are gathered here today in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, on this 25th day of May in 2019. And we are pretending to be discussing a new subject, but we are not. In fact, my dear fathers, we are discussing something that you discussed 56 years ago. And we are now recognizing that you warned us that if we did not unite, we will be conquered again. I am sadly reporting to you that we are being conquered again. We are being conquered again in the manner that you feared, and I'm now telling you that this time round our conquest is a little more subtle. I am telling you, Osagyefo, that now, although in 1961 you had created the University of Ghana at Legon, and you had also created the University of Science and Technology, in many African universities we are now accommodating Confucius Institute. Osagyefo, we do not know what they are going to teach there in 100 years' time. But for the moment, they tell us is aid and that they like us. But Osagyefo, I agree with you, there is no free lunch. We are also sitting here today in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, the home of your brother, Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And we also are reminding ourselves that Nyerere came up with a philosophy called Ujamaa, which was self-reliance. We can now tell you that in substance, Mwalimu was right. But unfortunately, we are still importing things from Europe. We now have mobile phones, which you did not have when you were alive. But unfortunately, Mwalimu, those mobile phones, none of them is made in Africa. Last week, we saw an attempt by somebody to claim that one was made in Rwanda, but I suspect it was only assembled in Rwanda. Mwalimu, we are trying. I can now also confirm to you that we have many political parties, just as you feared, Osagyefo. In Congo, there are 233. But Congo is not at peace. In Tanzania, they don't have very many, but I can assure you CCM is still doing very well. But Tanzania is the exception rather than the rule. After every election, Mwalimu, we fight. In Kenya, we did. Then we shake hands. Then we fight. Then we shake them again. We are in the business of shaking hands. In Central Africa, we are fighting. Our young men and women are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. We now know you are right. And therefore, going forward, we are today taking a solemn vow that each one of us will use the resources at our disposal, and that we are going as a product of this conference to send a paper which will emanate out of Julius Kambarage Festival, which paper will be sent to the African Union. And that paper will tell the African Union that there is a sense of urgency. And it will not stop there. That paper will also be sent to all the 55 African heads of state, reminding them that there is need for Africa to trade with ourselves, that there is need for Africans to travel on one visa, that there is need for Africans to have one currency, that there is need for Africans to define ourselves. And Osagyefo, I remind you, I remember during your lifetime, you hosted both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And I am reminded that at one time he was asking his people in the United States of America how long it would take to unite Africa. We are now telling you that it's not too long. It is not going to be long, because young men and women are now telling us that we unite or we perish. Osagyefo, Mwalimu, Seko, I would have written a longer letter, but I can now see that my audience wants to go for lunch. Permit me, therefore, to stop here in the knowledge that Pan-Africanism is alive and well, and Africa will realize our potential even if it takes 100 years. God bless you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that standing ovation says it all. He came and he delivered. But he assures me he has got some time to respond to some questions, some comments or other views. So please, you are welcome. Please say, identify yourself, where you come from, and be brief, because you can see we are so many of us, and I'm sure many would want also to have a word. Kwa hiyo karibu sana. Okay, let me, let me start with Aziz Fall.
I will be very brief. I am Aziz Fall, Secretary General of the Pan-Africanist Federalist Movement. Tomorrow, we're going to celebrate. As you just heard, maybe we should not celebrate, because we're supposed to celebrate our liberation. The analysis that was made was highlighted by different reports. Today, we have foreign military bases, we have plundering of our resources. But at the Pan-Africanist Federalist Movement, we are absolutely confident that within a generation, we're going to fast-track the movement. Within the next year, all African nations where we have section will start a process of referendum in order to fast-track all the ratification that the states have agreed on the union government and the process. We know it's going to be hard, and I simply give you a simple example. To come to Tanzania, a dream come true after all my teenage, I had to pay a visa, 6 weeks, and pay $350. Next time I will come to Tanzania, I will not have a visa. Tomorrow, and I beg you, all of you, let us celebrate and analyze the situation. I have come to convey the message of the movement, because we know that it is here that the first federation in the continent succeeded. But it is also here that the war on terror started. So Tanzania is for us the place where we have to learn. This generation, and I'm talking to this generation, in 20 years, if we start at the age of 5 in every country, we will speak Swahili in the whole African continent. So tomorrow afternoon, please, let us celebrate. Whether we have an audience, whether we stand in the tree, please let us share the strategy. And I would like to have the eloquence of Prof Lumumba and all the people who were kind enough to invite me to watch the film AFRICOM Go Home, Foreign Bases Out of Africa, which portrayed the emergency, the urgency of speeding and fast-tracking the process. Everything is already invented. We just have to implement, and this generation will do it. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Fall came all the way from Montreal, Canada. So that's why I allowed him a little bit more time to speak, and he has a very strong message. Otherwise, please, 2 minutes so that many more people can speak. Okay, I'll go this side. Okay, and I'm going to go for those who have not spoken. So that young man there, okay, Smama. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the greatest speech. But also, I have few comments on the African Union or African Pan-Africanism. First is to have the readers which are very bright and patriotic to their countries, because most of the African readers, they are not patriotic until today. And also is to come to the elites of Africans. They seek for their interest and not for the interest of all Africans. They don't take that particular education or kind of education which they acquire to put into the Africans, but they think to their self and to benefit the outside country or external country. So here we have to look on ourselves, and we have to start with ourselves at the right to think more and to think external in order to be the one to champion the African unity.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, no, this one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Plo, for the address. My name's Mondi Godfrey, first-year undergraduate student. Professor, for me, I'm quite pessimistic with the African Union. Why am I saying this? It's because of the education system that we are having right now. It does not train students, does not teach students, young people about Pan-Africanism. It doesn't train us at all, and if you are taught, then it's very little. So I'll also ask for your address on this one. But two, to be quick, the enemy we have. You have a lot of enemies. You spoke of the Chinese and the West. Now, I just want to give you some more details, just to add on what you spoke. The Foreign Ministry of Tanzania is China Aid. I saw the outside of it. This year, the Chinese built the State House of Burundi is China Aid, but also the chairs we're using here, they're China Aid. At the same time, even the library itself. So these are enemies that have entered in the system, and they are not willing to let us go. So I'll ask for your address on this one. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll go this side. Any ladies? I don't see ladies. Okay, that one there.
Okay, thank you. Professor Lumumba, if you're candid enough to talk of the shift of Africa from statist Pan-Africanism to democratization of African integration. And actually, you spoke of the conceptual definition and premises of African unity that had not been yet probably defined. And we see this is the reason even why by then Mwalimu Nyerere was against Kwame Nkrumah. It's the same reason why we see even other African leaders were against Muammar Gaddafi. So if we have not been candid enough to give the clear definition of the kind of the Pan-Africanism and the integrated conceptual definition of Pan-Africanism, do you really think that we are going to make these United States of Africa? And where are we going to?
Thank you. Okay, kule nyuma kabisa. Yeah. You remember t-shirt? Where we are, okay? Introduce yourself, we're Nani.
My name is Chris Tabenda. I'm a first-year undergraduate student in Coed. And I wanted to ask how, as African students and the African youth, how can we teach each other on how to decolonize our minds and propagate African excellence?
Thank you. Okay, I'll go upstairs. Kuna mic kule juu. Okay, nani anataka kuongea hapa? Huyu hapa, yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the wonderful presentation. I'm going to ask two main questions. From the thoughts of the great African leaders, they were greatly in respect of expression of various opinions in form of civil society movements. It was those civic movements during the Pan-Africanism movement that brought or spearheaded the African Revolution, which finally decolonized Africa. But today, our African leaders have crafted worldwide what is known as a non-gunmen to repress Africans who want to express their rights to correct a system. What is the African Union doing to pass a resolution to ensure that any African country where a good faith person speaks for the sake of his opinion and for the opinion of the rest, once killed by a non-gunman, this country must be isolated from the African Union? What are we doing about it? Number two, all presentations worldwide in African forums and forums, whatever English you call it, people keep lamenting about our inability to overcome our weaknesses. What steps are we taking? Should we keep lamenting, and for how long? We always lament about, for example, being dependent and dependency on dependency issues. How do the people that we beg the money from make their money? This is my question I want to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take the lady. Yes. Yes, Mama. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Wines Esenoloto. I'm a political science student from University of Dar es Salaam first year. Professor, you have talked about the issue of uniting African countries. And as far as I know is that most of African leaders have been corrupted by power. The power that they have is corrupting them, and they cannot. It seems like they are thinking that when we unite, who will be the great president? And you have talked about the issue of Chinese introducing their Confucius institutions in most of African universities. And not only the Chinese, but there are also other white people who have invested in most of their institutes in African countries. So how are we going to remove these institutes, or how are we going to solve this issue, as they have already imposed their ideas within our countries? They have already imposed everything, their technology, and it seems like it is very hard for us to get over their ideas, as they are already corrupting our mind. And if so, if we remove them, don't you think that it will be hard in African countries to stand on their own? And if it is hard for them to stand on their own, that means African countries are going to remain poor, and and it will be hard for African countries to unite.
Okay, thank you. So let the professor respond.
Let me, and I always preface this, my responses do not constitute the truth. That is what my views are. You may hold a totally different view. But let me start by responding to the last question. I don't hold the view, which would be reckless and misguided, that you demolish the Confucius Institute. No, not at all. What one is saying is that we must warn ourselves about what such institutes can and should do for us. It is good to have knowledge of what the Chinese do, but we must warn ourselves and ask ourselves, what is the long-term goal? Let me give you this example, and this is why many of the civilizations that have conquered Africa have always been ahead of us in terms of getting what they want. I'm quite certain that here in Dar es Salaam, as in many African capitals, we have the French Cultural Center, or the British Cultural Center, or the American Cultural Center. The reality of the world is that each civilization, whether they like it or not, or whether they deny it or not, would want to see their culture as the dominant culture. It is our duty to warn ourselves that these are only useful to this extent. And that is why in writing the book, Decolonizing the Mind, Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o says that it is incumbent upon us to identify that which is good. And if you look at the way we used to teach at our universities for a long time, when we taught literature in the 1970s, we used to talk about English literature. Then we recognized that it was not English literature, it was literature in English, because it was Chinua Achebe writing, it was David Rubadiri writing, it was Cyprian Ekwensi writing. And when we were teaching history at that time, we had courses which were history of the African national movements. We knew who was doing what in Guinea-Bissau. We knew who was doing what in Libya. We knew who was doing what in Addis Ababa. Africans knew what was happening in Africa. But if today you look at, we now have something that is called the competency-based education. We simply want people to be skillful plumbers or electricians, and there is nothing wrong with that. But history has demonstrated without times without number that the mind is the site of action in order to direct us in the right way. Permit me to give you an example. During our own lifetime, we have seen China rise. There is something to copy from the Chinese. There is definitely something to copy from the Chinese. We did not have phones from China today. Out of every 10 phones, there are possibly 6 Chinese phones. The Americans are so worried now that you see what they are doing with the Chinese. They want to completely dismember China so that it doesn't participate in the 5G. They did it because they were disciplined, because they know what they wanted, and they are going at it. And I'm submitting that we too can do that. And it is not because we don't have the capacity. There is something we call mobile telephony money transfer, which called M-Pesa in Kenya. That was an innovation of a young Kenyan. It tells you that Africans can do something. The Ugandan Makerere University came up with a bus, which is not in mass production, but is something that is made in Uganda. We are capable of doing these kinds of things. But I hold the view that we must lament. There are those who say we must, if there is a funeral, it's a funeral. There is a funeral. You want us to sing wedding songs during our funeral? There are things to lament about in Africa, and it is through the lamentations that we'll then discover what we do in order to realize our potential. For the moment, there are things that we must lament about. If we say that there's going to be the silencing of the guns in the year 2020 and there is no peace in Sudan, we should stop lamenting about it because we don't want to lament. If we talk about silencing the guns in the year 2020 and there is unrest in the Libya or in Sudan or in Mali or in Mauritania or in Burkina Faso, we've got to mention these things. It is by mentioning them that we recognize the enormity of the task. And uniting Africa is not for the faint-hearted. It is not for the faint-hearted. It's not instant coffee. He'll tell you. There are those who are going to dampen your spirit, who think you are a dreamer. You are engaged in dreams and romanticism, which will never realize anything. There is no shortage of naysayers. There is no shortage. But those of us who are older, like my Lord Judge here, will tell you during the East African community, there were things, it was a joy to have a common currency. It was a joy to move across Africa with a common currency during the East African Community one. That is why we came back again and said we need another East African community with a common currency. It was a joy for a Kenyan student to study in Dar es Salaam, to study in Makerere, and a Tanzanian student to study in Nairobi and in Uganda. It was a joy. We had one common education system. Now Kenya has our own education system, Tanzania our own, Uganda our own, Burundi our own. There is a sense in which we must harmonize all these things. Why should we pay $350? When I was at the airport at Julius Kambarage Nyerere, they have a list of countries which need no visa when you come into Africa. I look forward to the day when we will travel on one passport. And anybody who is an African doesn't need a visa. If you want some fee, there are ways of correcting revenue, but not through visas for fellow Africans. So I hold the view that there are things that can be done. Then there is the question of somebody talk about civic movements. You know, part of our problem, and I don't have an answer for this, I think the way we were trained, and the colonialists was ahead of time. Let's give the colonialists credit. The colonialists knew that if we are trained in a certain way, we will think in a certain way. That is our default mode. And those of us who have gone to school, if you are colonized by the British, there is a way in which you think. Even when if you are a judge, my Lord will tell you, you think that when you cite a leading English authority, Lord Danning having said something, you think you are now most learned. Lord Danning said it. If you have cited John Stuart Mill in some economic or you've cited some economic book written by an America or an Australia, you are great. You don't cite Zambia's Dambisa Moyo, no. There is the training, because we are trained to believe that we are inferior. And that is the ghost of inferiority is what we must exercise. Once we exercise the ghost of inferiority, then we are going to go somewhere. You know, somebody told me somewhere when my good friend talked about Kiswahili, and I'm happy that South Africa is adopting Kiswahili. A number of countries, we are beginning to hear voices about Kiswahili becoming the lingua franca of Africa. It is a good thing. Somebody told me something. He was from Sweden. I do not know whether he was right, but permit me to give you examples. That no civilization ever industrialized on the basis of another's language. Think about it. And he told me, he was from Sweden. We are a little country with no more than 11 million people. We train our young men and women in Swedish. Here in Nairobi, there are no more than 2,000 Swedes, but we have a Swedish school. Look at Sweden. Look at Norway. Look at Finland. Look at Denmark. Look at even Russia, the former Soviet Union countries, Ukraine. America is unique in the sense that it is a migrant country, but they chose to adopt English as their lingua franca. The first thing that a colonizing people do is to take away your language. Because once they have taken away your language, Mwalimu Nyerere said something that was very interesting. He said in Kiswahili at one time, I think it was in 1999, that, and he said it in Kiswahili, and I'm going to try and say it in Kiswahili. He said, nakumbuka mwaka wa 60 nikiwa rais. Na George Kahama, those of you who can't understand Kiswahili, somebody will translate. George Kahama alikuwa waziri wangu. Sasa nimemtuma George Kahama Tabora. Wanasafiri kwa ndege ndogo tu. Sasa kukawa na msukosuko kidogo. George Kahama akaniambia, tukasema, my God. My God. Kukawa na msukosuko. Akasema, mama we. Ikatingisha akasema, mama yo. And what Mwalimu was trying to say, that there are certain things that you can only express in a language that is natural to you. And I think that Kiswahili, being given its neutrality, can play that role. There's people who are saying that Kiswahili does not have the ability, is not a technical language, but language, one of the poorest languages on earth is English. Poor. Very poor vocabulary. But yet it is the most dominant language on earth because it adopts. It's like the ocean, it receives words. Lingua franca is now an English word. Safari is now an English word. Even Kiswahili will welcome words in order to enrich herself. So I think that that is a good thing. Decolonizing the mind is education. I think that education is at the heart of it. Many of the academics who are here, and I'm repeating this point, the academics here, how do we teach law? For example, how do we teach medicine? We must ask ourselves, how is it, for example, in African countries, we have professors of medicine, professors of engineering, professors of law. Here we have Muhimbili, we have Mulago, we have Mama Yemo in Kinshasa, we have Kenyatta. And yet, pole pole, when a senior government, until of course when President Magufuli came, is a little different now. But your typical African leader, when they are sick, they have no faith in the professor. They go to India. Does it not call into question our confidence in ourselves? Why do we go to India? And we are living professors, yeah. Professor of medicine, a physician, a surgeon. But we are going to India to a doctor whom we do not know completely. We don't know who he is, and we are confident that they are treating us. And you recommend, we who have gone to school, the people who have not gone to school are fine. They go to the traditional doctor and the things are concocted, and by faith they get healed. You remember Loliondo at one time here in Tanzania. People are going to Loliondo and drinking cups and cups, and they were getting healed. So these are the questions, in my view, that we must ask ourselves. What are we teaching? But we are not confident enough. We are too comfortable in our sites, we who are in academic institutions. Nowadays, when I'm a practicing lawyer, when I look at, for example, the tribunal when there was the conflict in Rwanda, we had the tribunal for Rwanda here in Arusha. How many people did they try? Perhaps not, very few. And how many billions did they consume? Billions. When the Rwandese government went to their own traditional systems called gacaca, they tried millions, and the society is healing. Which university, which academic has written a PhD thesis on gacaca as a method of dispute resolution? Instead, we are teaching in many African countries. We have people coming from the United States, from the United Kingdom, teaching us mediation and conciliation and giving us certificates. How did we resolve our dispute? Through mediation and conciliation. And you'll find a university in Africa say, we are hosting a conference of mediation and conciliation, and there'll be a professor from Harvard University to teach us how to mediate on marriage conflicts in Tanzania. Marriage. And we give certificates and we are happy about it. I'm saying we must do something about it. And it's this institution that must begin to do something about it. The other question that I was asked is about my definition of Pan-Africanism. Once again, it is the problem that we have. Because we think in English, because we are handicapped, even our thoughts in English cannot be articulated well enough. We are handicapped in our analysis because the language is not ours. So we are apt to say, for example, you'll hear many who talk against Pan-African say, there is classical Pan-African. You ask them, what is classical? They have no idea what classical is. You ask them what democracy is. They tell you, democracy was defined by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Why must Abraham Lincoln be the one to define democracy for us? Can't we define democracy? Don't we know what good governance is? Can't we define it without reference to them? In other words, as I said at a different forum, we have been confined to think inside some box. Nowadays, they tell us to think slightly outside of the box. But I'm telling us, let us think without the box. We just eliminate the box and we begin thinking. Then we will begin to think about new things. And then China. I cite China, I think 80% with admiration. I admire the Chinese because I've seen in my lifetime, in my rural village on Lake Victoria now, we should be renamed if you ask me. We are eating fish, tilapia from China. Somebody is farming tilapia in China. I do not know what they feed tilapia there. But they then bring them for us to eat, fact. And yet there is a lake there. We are importing chicken from Brazil and eggs from Brazil. Have our chicken forgotten how to lay eggs? You know, these are the little things that annoys one. And I'm submitting to us, therefore, in defining Pan-Africanism, and he's been at it, we are at it in different ways. Let us not imprison ourselves in this definition, whether it's state or this. What we want is an Africa. I'm putting it in a very crude way. I wish I was saying it in my mother tongue. What we want is an Africa where the boundaries imposed on us are purely for purposes of administration, where the boundaries do not stop one Africa from moving from one country to the other in an orderly manner. We are not saying that there will be disorder. Where there will be a form of government, whether the so-called presidents will now be called governors, I do not know. We'll find a name for them. But they'll simply administer that territory, but there will be a Pan-African government that regulates us on critical matters, on defense, on foreign affairs, on matters of the economy and currency, on the exploitation of our resources, that determines how we defend ourselves. And I can't agree with you more. You know, if today Africa, if the United States of America wanted to destroy Africa, it could do so in 1 week. This is how. They would station 2 carriers on Indian Ocean, 2 down south, 2 in the west, and 2 in the Mediterranean, and they would unleash all these missiles and would be back into the Stone Age. We are weak. And now, because we have bases in Djibouti, you have an American base, you have a Chinese base, you have a Japanese. In other words, Africa is in a situation which it cannot control. If there was a war today, Africa is a target. In a war that we do not know. We have been involved. When the European tribes were fighting in 1914, they don't call them tribal wars. But when the European tribes were fighting in 1914, we were there. And I'm sure there is a monument here in Tanzania commemorating Africans who participated in a tribal wars. The English tribe was fighting the German tribe and the French. Then they fought another tribal war in 1939. They're always fighting, and they involve us, and they weaken us. And I'm submitting that going forward, we must define ourselves, but not allow somebody else to define us. But I was talking about China as my last point in answering the question, why is China unique? When you talk about China, it is 1.4 billion of them. Suppose you are baking bread for 1.4 billion, bread, and only half of them eat the bread. You are a billionaire immediately. But here, you are baking bread in Tanzania. You want to sell the bread in Nairobi, Kenya. Tariffs. You want to sell bread in Malawi, tariffs. You want to sell bread in Uganda, tariffs. You have maize in Malawi. There is a glut of maize in Malawi and a shortage of maize in Kenya, and we do not know. So where do we go? Brazil. And one is saying that the reason why China is great is a true market, a single market. The United States of America is great because it's a single market. The European Union now is largely a single market, despite the British wanting to leave it. It's a good market, a single market. And we must create a market where we trade. Do you know, if you ask any average student of political science today what is happening in Guinea-Bissau or what is being produced in Guinea-Bissau in terms of agriculture, they don't know. So going forward, we must emulate China because China knows what it wants, and we must copy them. You know, the beauty of being in Africa is that we can now copy other civilizations and avoid some of the mistakes that they made and make it better. And I conclude with one thing. Look at the mobile telephone. Today, tell me, each one of us here has a mobile telephone. Each one of us. Those who are doing well have 2. Others have 3. Others even have 4. Tell me, apart from MTN, which is South African, and Econet, which other mobile telephone line is owned by Africans? So when you say kuna salio, the salio is going to Europe. When there is profit that is being made, it is being made and being declared in London. That is our weakness. You've talked about chairs. If you look at what we have now, this microphone is not made in Tanzania or in any African country. These seats are possibly Chinese. This camera that is being used here is not made in Tanzania. The watch that he is wearing is not made in Tanzania. The shoes is not made in Tanzania. If today we were to say we abandon, we only wear what is African, all of us here would be naked. All. I'm being melodramatic in order to dramatize our plight. But you go to India, you find that the clothes they wear is from their textile industry. You go to Vietnam, which was bombed to the ground in 1975. Vietnam now produces more coffee than Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania combined. I do not know whether they have not brought McDonald's here, but they have Kentucky Fried Chicken. Do you have KFC here? So even our chicken must be fried like they do in Kentucky. There is no Mwanza fried chicken. You know, there are little things, but they are the ones that define us. Do you have water in Tanzania called Dasani? Coca-Cola. In other words, even the water that we drink now is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. That is how we are. And in a Pan-African Union, we would, in my view, we are not saying you'll eliminate all those things. They'll be there. This is a free market. But we must have products that compete. So in a nutshell, I can't agree with you more that there is something to celebrate, because this awareness in itself is a good thing. The fact that we have a forum, you know, I do not know whether young people here, have you read Nyerere? Because we are so oral, you just listen to Kauli ya Mwalimu, those sound bites. That is not Nyerere. Read Nyerere. Read Kwame, read Lumumba, read Modibo. The things we are saying here were defined. There are some people who think that you can have a sense of the future without having a sense of history. You can't. You've got to have a sense of history. Why do people have museums? To remind them about certain things. So this Pan-African movement, I think, is a good thing. And I think each one of us, it's Mwalimu used to say, it can't be done. Play your part. And I think that is how modest we should be. It can't be done. Play your part. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it all. It can be done. Play your part. So please, let's put our hands together for our distinguished guest of honor. Tunakushukuru sana Profesa, na tunahakika utatukubalia tena mwaka ujao uje tena utuzungumze. Asante sana.